It started with a headache. That is the cruelest part of this entire story. Not the poison, not the panic, not the investigation that stretched across decades and still has no ending. No, the cruelest part is that it started with something so ordinary, so utterly human, so completely unremarkable that you have probably done it yourself 100 times without thinking. Someone had a headache, or a muscle ache, or a mild fever, and they did what people do. They went to the medicine cabinet, or they walked to the nearest drugstore, or they reached across a kitchen counter and grabbed a red-end white bottle. A bottle that sat on shelves across America in gas stations and grocery stores and pharmacies, in homes and offices and hospital waiting rooms, a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, which was in the autumn of 1982 one of the most trusted products in the United States of America. They twisted off the cap. They shook out a capsule. And they swallowed it. And then they died. Welcome, sit down, because what you are about to hear is not a story from a distant century or a faraway country. It did not happen in wartime or during a plague or in the pages of a detective novel. It happened in the American suburbs, in kitchens and bathrooms and bedrooms, to ordinary people, young and old, people with names and families and plans for the following week. It happened in the fall when the leaves were turning gold and the air had that clean autumn bite and children were thinking about Halloween costumes, and nobody suspected that something as innocent as a pain reliever could be a murder weapon. Nobody suspected because nobody had ever done this before. This was something new. This was the moment the world changed. This is the story of the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders, and it is without question one of the most terrifying, most consequential, and most deeply unsettling criminal cases in modern American history. Not because of the number of victims, though 7 people died, and 7 lives is 7 universes of grief. Not because of the method, though the method was so simple, so devilishly, almost insultingly simple that it still haunts every person who has ever studied this case. It is terrifying because of what it revealed, about vulnerability, about trust, about how thin the line is between safety and catastrophe in a modern society built on the assumption that the products we buy will not kill us. And it is unsettling in a way that lodges under the skin and stays there because of how it ended. Or rather, because of how it did not end. Because the person who did this was never caught, never identified with certainty, never tried, never convicted, never explained. They killed 7 people in one of the most audacious acts of public poisoning in American history. They rewrote the rules of consumer safety. They changed the way every bottle of medicine in the world is sealed and sold, and then they walked away. They are in all likelihood still out there somewhere, or they have died. We do not know. We may never know, and that not knowing is its own kind of horror. Let us begin. The year is 1982. Chicago, Illinois. The city is enormous and humming, a place of steel and wind and neighborhoods stacked one against another, of commuters and factory workers and suburban families who drive into the city for work and drive back out to their ranch houses and 2-car garages and tidy yards every evening. America in 1982 is a country in the middle of a recession, still shaking off the stagflation of the 70s, still figuring out who it is in the decade of Ronald Reagan and MTV and the Walkman. People are stressed, people have headaches, people take Tylenol. Tylenol, the brand name for acetaminophen, had by 1982 become the best-selling pain reliever in America. It had overtaken aspirin. It was recommended by doctors and pharmacists. It was the thing you gave your children when they had a fever. It was the thing you took after a long day, after a hard workout, after too many hours staring at a screen. Johnson & Johnson, the company that made it, had spent years building the product's reputation as safe, reliable, gentle on the stomach. The name alone carried a kind of reassurance. Tylenol, it even sounds calm. It sounds like something that fixes things. The extra-strength capsules in particular were enormously popular, little red and white gelatin capsules that dissolved quickly and seemed to work fast, and which sat in red and white bottles with plain, honest-looking labels on pharmacy shelves all over the country. On the morning of September 29, 1982, a 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman woke up in her home in Elk Grove Village, a suburb northwest of Chicago. She had the sniffles, maybe a slight sore throat. Her parents gave her a single extra-strength Tylenol capsule and sent her to the bathroom. Minutes later, she collapsed on the bathroom floor. By the time emergency services arrived, she could not be saved. Mary Kellerman was 12 years old. The doctors assumed it was some kind of sudden medical event, an aneurysm perhaps, or a cardiac episode. Tragic, inexplicable, the kind of thing that happens sometimes with devastating randomness. Nobody connected it to the Tylenol. Not yet. That same day, the very same day, September 29, 1982, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus died in his home in Arlington Heights, another suburb north of Chicago. He had taken extra-strength Tylenol for chest pain. Within hours of his death, his family gathered at his house, devastated and confused. His brother Stanley, 25 years old, and Stanley's wife Teresa, 19 years old, were there among the mourners. They were in shock. They had headaches. Someone found the bottle of Tylenol that Adam had taken from the kitchen counter, the same bottle, sitting right there, and Stanley and Teresa each took a capsule. Both of them collapsed within the hour. Both of them died within days. 3 members of the same family, the same bottle. And still, at first, no one made the connection. 2 more deaths followed in rapid succession. Mary McFarland, 31 years old, a mother from Elmhurst, died after taking Tylenol for a headache at work. Paula Prince, 35 years old, a United Airlines flight attendant, was found dead in her Chicago apartment. A bottle of Tylenol was on her bathroom counter. And then Mary Reener, 27 years old, died in Winfield. She had just given birth to her 4th child a week before. She had a headache. She took Tylenol. 7 people, 7 deaths, in a single metropolitan area, in a single week. And all of them, every single one, had taken extra-strength Tylenol capsules from bottles purchased at different stores across the Chicago suburbs. It was not a coincidence, but it took a little while for that truth to crystallize. And the way it crystallized is itself a remarkable story of human intuition and institutional urgency colliding at exactly the right moment. The break came through a combination of sharp police work and a fire department lieutenant named Philip Capitelli. He had heard about the Janus family deaths, 3 members of the same family, all dead, all apparently healthy before that day, and something about it nagged at him. He made a phone call to a colleague, a firefighter named Richard Keyworth, and together they started connecting dots. The Janus family, the Tylenol, the other deaths being reported in local emergency rooms. They brought their suspicions to the police, who brought them to the medical examiner, who went back to look at the tissue samples and the toxicology results. And there it was. Potassium cyanide. Each of the victims had ingested a lethal dose of potassium cyanide, the kind of dose that kills within minutes, the kind of dose that in a gelatin capsule looks completely identical to a capsule of acetaminophen. Someone had opened the capsules, dumped out the medicine, filled them with cyanide, resealed them, put them back in the bottles, and returned the bottles to store shelves. Not in one store, in several stores across multiple suburbs, multiple bottles, multiple batches. A coordinated, deliberate, cold-blooded act of mass murder. The moment this was confirmed, on the evening of October 1, 1982, the city of Chicago descended into something close to controlled panic. Police drove through neighborhoods with loudspeakers, warning residents not to take Tylenol. Local television stations broke into regular programming. Johnson & Johnson issued an immediate nationwide recall, one of the fastest and most sweeping product recalls in American corporate history. 31 million bottles of Tylenol were pulled from shelves. The company offered to exchange any existing Tylenol for safe alternatives. They halted production. They cooperated fully with investigators. It was, many would later say, a textbook example of how a corporation should respond to a crisis, transparently, responsibly, at enormous financial cost, prioritizing human life over profit. But by then, 7 people were already dead. The investigation that followed was one of the largest in Illinois history. The FBI, the FDA, local police departments, and state investigators all poured resources into the case. They went back through the supply chain. They examined where the poison bottles had been manufactured, where they had been distributed, which stores had received them. They found that all the affected bottles had come from 2 different production lots, made at 2 different Johnson & Johnson facilities, which meant the tampering had not happened at the factory. It had happened after the bottles reached store shelves or at some point in the distribution chain. Someone had walked into stores, taken bottles off the shelves, taken them somewhere, opened the capsules, laced them with cyanide, resealed them, and put them back. Or possibly had tampered with them in the store itself, right there in the aisle where anyone might walk by. Think about that for a moment, just sit with it. Someone walked into a pharmacy or a grocery store, the kind of store you shop in, the kind of store your family shops in, picked up a bottle of medicine and turned it into a killing device. And then put it back and walked away, and nobody saw them, nobody stopped them, nobody thought anything of it, because what kind of person does that? What kind of mind conceives of such a thing and then executes it with the calm, deliberate efficiency of someone running an errand? Investigators had no answer to that question, not then and not ever. They did develop suspects. The most prominent and the one who has cast the longest shadow over this case is a man named James Lewis. Lewis was a con artist, a forger, a deeply unstable and deeply intelligent man with a history of fraud and a gift for manipulation. In the days after the Tylenol deaths, he sent an extraordinary letter to Johnson & Johnson. In this letter, he claimed responsibility for the murders. He demanded $1 million be deposited into a specific bank account. He explained with a kind of casual arrogance that if Johnson & Johnson paid him, he would tell them how to stop the killings. It was the letter of someone who wanted to be noticed, who wanted to be important, who wanted to use the deaths of 7 people as leverage for personal gain. Or alternatively, it was the letter of someone who had not actually done it and knew he had not done it and thought he could exploit the situation without real consequence. Because that ultimately is the defense that James Lewis has maintained for decades. He did not put the cyanide in the capsules, he said. He was not in Chicago during the relevant period, he was in New York with his wife. He sent the letter, yes. He admitted that, it was extortion, it was monstrous, but it was not murder. The FBI investigated Lewis exhaustively. His alibi was difficult to fully disprove. No physical evidence placed him at any of the stores where the poisoned bottles were found. No evidence connected him to the purchase or possession of potassium cyanide. He was convicted of extortion in 1983 and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. He was never charged with murder. He was released in 1995. In 2009, investigators executed new search warrants on his home in connection with the Tylenol case, fueled by new forensic analysis of the handwriting on the bottles and letters. Nothing definitive resulted. James Lewis died in July 2023 at the age of 76. He took whatever he knew or whatever he did not know with him. And the case remained officially unsolved. There were other suspects over the years. A man named Roger Arnold, who was peripherally connected to the case through an acquaintance and who later committed an unrelated murder. Various individuals who were investigated and cleared. Tips that came in from across the country and led nowhere. The case was never closed, but it was never solved. It became one of those crimes that sits in the files, accumulating paper, waiting for the breakthrough that never comes. But here is the thing. Here is what separates the Tylenol murders from nearly every other unsolved case in American history. The crime did not end with the investigation. The crime did not end with the convictions that never came. The crime did not end with the death of James Lewis or the passage of 40 years. The crime ended, or rather it transformed, into something that outlasted all of it, something that changed the world. Because in the immediate aftermath of September and October of 1982, Congress moved with extraordinary speed to pass the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, which made it a federal crime to tamper with consumer products. The Food and Drug Administration issued new regulations requiring tamper-evident packaging on all over-the-counter medications and consumer health products. Johnson & Johnson, once they relaunched Tylenol, and they did relaunch it within months in a move that became a case study in crisis management and brand recovery, they introduced triple-seal tamper-evident packaging. The bottle had a glued box, a plastic seal over the cap, and a foil seal under the cap. 3 layers of visible protection. 3 signals to the consumer that no one had touched this bottle since it left the factory. Every single bottle of medicine you have ever opened in your life, the plastic ring around the cap that tears when you open it for the first time, the foil seal you have to peel or puncture before you can get to the pills, the cotton stuffed inside that you have to pull out, all of it, every bit of that infrastructure exists because of what happened in Chicago in the fall of 1982. Every time you open a bottle of aspirin or Benadryl or NyQuil or vitamins and you peel back that foil seal, you are living in the aftermath of 7 murders. You are the beneficiary of a tragedy. You are protected by a lesson written in the blood of people who never knew their deaths would change the world. Mary Kellerman, 12 years old. She got up that morning with a runny nose and she took a capsule and she died in a bathroom, and because she died, because all 7 of them died, you are safer today than you were before. That is a devastating thing to say. It is not comforting. It is not redemption. There is no redemption in a 12-year-old child dying of cyanide poisoning in her family's home, but it is the truth, and the truth has to be held whole even when it is ugly. The murders also sparked an immediate wave of copycat crimes. In the weeks and months following the Chicago deaths, there were hundreds of product tampering incidents reported across the United States. Tylenol and other medicines were found to have been tampered with in states from coast to coast. Most of these turned out to be hoaxes, or incidents of someone discovering a defective capsule and assuming the worst, or in some cases real tampering done by people who had been inspired by the Chicago case and saw it as a template. Several people died in copycat incidents in the years that followed. The original killings had not just taken 7 lives, they had in a sense given a demonstration to every disturbed mind in America. They had shown that it could be done. This is the darkest part of the story, not the poison, not the investigation. The fact that the Chicago murders functioned in a horrible way as a proof of concept. as an instruction manual, as an act of violence so novel and so apparently successful in that the killer was never caught that it inspired imitation. The original crime multiplied. The original crime echoed forward through decades, through subsequent product tampering laws and regulations and enforcement, through the FDA's expanded oversight of consumer safety, through the protocols that every pharmaceutical company now follows in the design of their packaging. The crime became policy. The crime became infrastructure. The crime became part of the invisible architecture of modern life. Who did it? That question has never been answered with certainty. The FBI considers the case one of its most significant unsolved investigations. Several theories have circulated over the decades. Some investigators believe it was a targeted attack by someone with a grudge against a specific victim, or against Johnson & Johnson, who expanded the scope to create confusion and cover tracks. Others believe it was purely random, the act of someone who wanted to cause harm on a large scale without any specific target, someone who chose Tylenol because it was popular and trusted and therefore would cause maximum damage to maximum numbers of people. Others still believe it was a business competitor or a disgruntled employee or someone with an insurance angle. James Lewis remains the most discussed suspect, but discussing is not the same as proving, and the legal standard of proof is not the same as a journalistic or narrative standard of suspicion. He maintained his innocence regarding the murders to the end of his life, and there are investigators who believe he did not do it, who believe the extortion letter was exactly what Lewis said it was, an opportunistic attempt to profit from someone else's crime. Someone else, whoever they are or were, has never been named, has never been charged, has never sat across a table from investigators and explained what they did or why, has never looked at the families of Mary Kellerman and Adam and Stanley and Teresa Janus and Mary McFarland and Paula Prince and Mary Reener and offered them anything, not an admission, not an apology, not even the terrible gift of a name. The families of the victims have spent decades in that particular purgatory that comes from violent, unexpected loss combined with the absence of justice. There is no trial to attend. There is no verdict to receive. There is no sentencing hearing where you can speak and have your words enter the official record of the event. There is only the loss and the years and the bottles of medicine on the shelves of every pharmacy in America, sealed in triple layers of tamper-proof packaging that exist because your person died. Paula Prince's sister, Lynn Rayer, became one of the most vocal advocates for victims' families in the case. She spent years pushing for the investigation to be reopened, for new forensic tools to be applied, for the case to receive the attention she believed it deserved. When the FBI executed those new search warrants on James Lewis's home in 2009, it was partly because of the pressure that victims' families had maintained. The case was not forgotten. It could not be forgotten because the people whose lives were unmade by it refused to let it be forgotten. And then James Lewis died in 2023, and the possibility of a confession died with him, if he had one to give. Here is something worth sitting with. You live in a world where the security of your medicine cabinet has been shaped by a murder. The seal on your bottle of pain reliever is a memorial. It is ugly and it is true, and it is the kind of thing that is easy to not think about, because thinking about it means thinking about the fact that someone somewhere once turned the most ordinary act of taking medicine into an act of dying. It means thinking about Mary Kellerman, 12 years old, going to the bathroom with the sniffles on a Wednesday morning in 1982. It means thinking about Teresa Janus, 19 years old, taking a Tylenol to get through the shock of her brother-in-law's inexplicable death, not knowing she was taking the same poison that had killed him. It means thinking about all 7 of them. And about the families left behind, and about the person who walked into those stores with a plan and a bottle of cyanide and no conscience, and who is, to this day, not definitively known to us. This is a story without a proper ending. Most true stories are. Novels get endings because writers can write them. Life does not always cooperate. The Tylenol murders are an open wound in American legal history, not bleeding the way it was in 1982 but not healed either. The case file is still open. The FBI still officially considers it unsolved. And somewhere in the files, there are photographs and handwriting samples and forensic analysis and decades of leads and dead ends. All of it sitting there waiting for something, a new piece of evidence, a deathbed confession, a DNA breakthrough, a witness who has been silent for 40 years and suddenly decides they cannot be silent anymore. It may never come. But here is what has come. Here is what has already arrived in the only form that history ever delivers its lessons. The 7 victims of the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders are, in a specific and verifiable and permanent sense, responsible for one of the most widespread improvements in consumer safety in the history of modern commerce. The packaging regulations that their deaths produced have prevented, it is impossible to know exactly how many, but certainly thousands of deaths in the decades since. The tamper-evident seal is one of the most effective passive safety measures ever introduced into consumer products. It costs almost nothing to manufacture. It takes a fraction of a second to check, and it has made product tampering enormously more difficult, more detectable, and more likely to result in prosecution. 7 deaths, millions of lives made safer. The mathematics of tragedy are always monstrous, but they are real. And the killer, whoever they were, almost certainly did not intend any of this. They intended fear. They intended chaos. They may have intended profit if Lewis's letter was genuine. They may have intended something personal and private and strange that we will never understand. What they did not intend was to become the reason that every bottle of Tylenol, every bottle of aspirin, every bottle of cold medicine and allergy medicine and vitamin supplements sold in the United States is sealed in layers of protective packaging. They did not intend to become the catalyst for federal legislation that made product tampering a serious federal crime. They did not intend to transform Johnson & Johnson's crisis response into the gold standard for corporate accountability. They did not intend any of that, but that is what they did. That is the legacy they created without meaning to. There is something almost unbearable about that. The killer, whoever they are, made the world marginally safer for everyone in it through the act of trying to make it more dangerous. They tried to destroy trust and instead created the infrastructure for rebuilding it. They tried to cause chaos and instead produced clarity, clarity about what needed to change, clarity about how vulnerable the public was, clarity about the responsibilities of corporations and regulators and lawmakers in protecting the people who buy their products. None of this is justice. Let us not call it justice because it is not. Justice would be a name and a trial and a verdict and Mary Kellerman alive at 54 years old and Adam Janus growing old with his family and Teresa Janus who was 19 and newly married when she died 19 getting to live her life. Justice would be the families of 7 people knowing why, knowing who, being given the minimum dignity of an explanation. None of that happened, none of that may ever happen. But the story, the full, terrible, complicated, consequence-laden story that exists, that is real, that happened. And you are part of it every time you reach for a bottle and check the seal before you open it, every time the little plastic ring snaps and you know that no one has been there before you. Every time that happens, you are connected across the decades to a Wednesday morning in September 1982, to a 12-year-old girl with a runny nose, to a city that woke up one morning and discovered that safety was not the same as certainty. Remember that, not to be afraid though fear is a reasonable response, not to be paranoid though vigilance is reasonable too. Remember it because it happened, because they were real people, because someone did this and was never held accountable, and because the world in response decided that this particular vulnerability would never be that wide open again. The seal on your medicine bottle is a promise. It is imperfect. It was purchased at a terrible price. But it is there every time telling you that someone somewhere cared enough to put it between you and the darkness. 7 people paid for that promise. Their names were Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Riener. Say their names.